Thanks. Really useful introduction as well from Collier that laid out a lot of the similar problems I want to address. And it's usefully finished with the very famous Gramsci quote, which is completely unavoidable whenever you start talking about the possibility of an end of an order or an end of an era. And I think I remember once standing here giving a very short introduction to the Academy overall when I mentioned this quote. And I mentioned then, and I still believe, that even though it's really, really seductive quote that captures so much about the problems that we face whenever we think about the transition of orders, I've always really disliked the quote. The key bit in the quote is the new cannot be born, and I think that diagnosis by Gramsci has always been especially kind of seductive for left-wing intellectuals in particular, because it's kind of relieves you of the pressure of having to do anything. It's like, it can't be born. That's kind of tough luck, guys. Like, there's nothing to do, is there? Like, we're just the historical circumstances we live in. We're better off just kind of go and retreat into our studies or make jokes about the current order. So my instinct, whenever confronting this question of the order, is to try and, at the same time as diagnosing what's gone wrong, what's failing, what needs to what the old order that needs to pass. I think any analysis that doesn't at the same time indicate what might be coming into being or what needs to come into being is kind of quietist, it kind of relieves us of the burden of having to really think clearly. So then, what is the order that I think is at the very least in crisis, if not it's actually coming to an end? And most people fall relatively naturally on Collier talks about the end of liberal democracy, people talk about the end of liberalism. I tend to use the term the liberal order, the order that that dominated at least since the Second World War and has genesis much before that, but that's the order that I think is coming to an end or needs to come to an end, the liberal order. And it's worth saying that I think particularly the liberal order is not the same as liberalism. So the liberal order wore the clothes of liberalism as a political ideology, but advanced, deliberately or not, but was about advancing a very different agenda. And you might say that the liberal order is a marriage of liberal institutions like free market, the rule of law, separation of powers, international financial capital system, etc., etc. It's a marriage of liberal institutions with an illiberal ideology. An ideology that says that the most important thing is essentially to control humankind, to control individual choices, to focus on the individual only in as much as the individual is a problem to be managed, a person that needs to be contained. And so the liberal order is deceptive and seductive in being able to broadcast openly and publicly that it's about the kind of triumph of the liberal individual. It wears the clothes of the good parts of liberal ideology, but at the same time is like a wolf in sheep's clothing, is actually kind of not what it makes out to be. And you could ask very legitimately, is this order passing? And we can perhaps remain ambivalent on whether it's finally about to collapse, but you can see that all of the fundamental parts of the liberal order, I think you can see quite clearly, are in fundamental crisis. So in economics, the supposedly liberal dynamic economic order has produced, at least in Western countries, fundamental sclerosis, halt in living standards, increasing pressure on people's living standards, a lack of dynamism, all of these things. So in economics, it certainly has stopped delivering the goods. Geopolitically, the liberal order has produced a new era of great power competition and territorial aggression, the very thing that the post-Second World Order was supposed to ensure against. Culturally and in social life, it's created a background of tremendous anxiety, social breakdown, the collapse in natural socialization between the generations, the culture war, and has created, as people that these events have talked about before, a disempowered and diminished human subject, the kind of stuff that's talked about so well in Culture of Narcissism by Lasch. And then, of course, politically, it's led to crisis after crisis as elites try and fail to contain the widespread anger that all of these crises have brought about in ordinary people. So I think you can say quite clearly, you take any aspect of this system that fits together, it's in fundamental crisis. And in all these examples, actually, you kind of see that the liberal order is liberal in name only, or rather, it takes from liberalism only those things that are kind of conducive to social control and rejects everything that's conducive to the liberation of mankind. So in economics, the supposedly liberal free market economic order was most about creating a predictable worker and consumer, and in doing so suffocated all of the natural dynamism that the productivity gains of capitalism ultimately rested on. In the cultural and social system, the liberal order created, as I said, a diminished human subject of individuals that ended up seeking replacements for the freedom that was denied to them in social life in identity politics or consumption or sex or mass culture. The problem being that this kind of narcissism is no foundation for a social order. You can't build a society under such conditions when everybody feels so constrained, atomized, and ridden with anxiety. And as I said, the geopolitical system was supposedly an attempt to constrain any conflict, but in doing this, created a series of fictions that made it impossible to predict and deal with those very kind of animal passions that it was supposed to contain. So the idea of the end of history, which grew very naturally out of the Second World War settlement in many ways, that robbed, especially elites, but wider society, of the kind of both military but also political tools necessary to actually see the coming of an era of great power conflict. And then obviously the liberal political order, in constraining individual control over the system and denying the possibility of mass politics and of democracy, of attempting essentially to regulate the messy and unpredictable world of politics. The result of this was it undermined itself again there by, as it were, kind of breaking down all of those natural, as it were, release valves that political systems used to have in order to understand mass discontent. So if you were unhappy with the order, you could at least vote against it, and that indicated to elites that there was something going wrong. But the less power you gave to ordinary people to voice their concerns, the less able the system was to respond to them. And so this is what, and in lots of the post-liberal thinkers, this is, I think, one of the things they get right when saying, as Collier again indicated, that liberalism, when they say that liberalism undermined itself, they get this at least right. They recognize that certain structural features of the liberal order eventually ended up producing the very crisis that we face now. But at the same time, this is where some of those critics, I think, go wrong, and so many of these critics end up kind of rejecting the whole idea of liberal democracy. So they especially get very angry about the notions of autonomy and freedom that are supposedly at the heart of liberal democracy. And in some ways you can kind of understand them for taking issue with these concepts, because as I said, the liberal order presents itself as being the champion of individual freedom and autonomy. So you can kind of understand that if you've got a system that says we're all about individual autonomy, the system goes into crisis, maybe it's somewhat sympathetic to think, oh, well, maybe the problem was all of this autonomy that supposedly was granted to people. But this, if what I've said in the foregoing is right, this gets things kind of the wrong way around, because the liberal order was never about giving freedom and autonomy to individuals. It was always about controlling the individual and limiting freedom, in making the liberal individual stable, predictable, regularized. It was not about freeing him. So it's as if these critics of the liberal order, of liberal democracy, lots of these post-liberal critics, they kind of take the propaganda of the regime at face value. They don't actually go beneath the surface and try and understand what this order was really about. So that problem that they have with actually diagnosing what went wrong about the system is really, I think, really fundamental. And I'd far rather we began to try and think about a critique that took what was genuinely fundamental in the system, which is not autonomy and freedom, because that was never the effective aim of the institutions that were developed on the basis of the liberal order. Instead, as I've said, the aim was always to limit, frustrate, contain, render predictable the messy world of politics. And so our critique, if there is to be a critique of the order that's passing, has to be based on that fundamental thing. Now, what's the response to this kind of breakdown, this crisis of what I've called the liberal order? Well, in almost all Western countries, the response, I think, is that you see the same two things over and over again. The first is you see rising support for populist parties and candidates. And then the second is you see from the regime the doubling down of support for this broken system, albeit sometimes with token references to hearing your concerns, or as was already indicated about Keir Starmer, kind of gesturing in one direction that we recognise there are problems, but then kind of quickly retracting them. And of course, on the whole, lots of these populist parties are actually just quite straightforward. They're captured very well by the name of the Portuguese populist party, Chega, which is enough. And there are, of course, degrees of intellectual sophistication and differences of opinion among these different populist parties, but they all unite, as it were, on this basic demand, no more. And it always means no more to this system, no more to this current way of doing things. How then should we kind of, as it were, judge or try and understand some of these populist movements? Of course, those who make up the regime will quickly tell you they should be dismissed because they're racist or obsessed with the past or anti-democratic and so on. But I think we can be a lot more radical, and we can say the true criteria by which we should judge populist parties is, are they revolutionary? Are the populist parties revolutionary? Why do they need to be revolutionary? Well, it's straightforwardly because, as I've said, I think we can be confident in saying that a whole order has been brought into question. This is not just a question of maybe changing migration policies here or tinkering with the economy there or having a kind of debate about environmentalism there, right? This is a fundamental crisis of a very particular order. And so the response to it has to be radical. It has to be genuinely revolutionary. And when I say revolutionary, I don't necessarily mean we all need to go and man the barricades. Not all revolutions have to be like the French Revolution. I mean, we could say that it's quite interesting that the country that has so far, for better or worse, led the way in the populist revolution is Trump's America. There's a different model of revolutions available, which is seen in the history of the American Revolution. And for many decades, America has been relatively successful at being able to return to that revolutionary memory, that sense of returning things, the revolution, the return, etymologically. And of course, even some Trumpist elements have always harked back to that new beginning in the American Revolution. Of course, one of the precursor movements to Trumpism was, of course, the Tea Party. And while Trump might have been mired in all kinds of difficulties since the election, and lots of what Trumpists have done has been rather muddled and ill thought out at times, but the fact remains that Trump is the only figure in Western politics for a generation or more who's actually acted, not just talked, but actually acted in a way that suggests an ambition to address every aspect of the crisis of the liberal order head on. So lest we forget, since taking office, he's attempted to fundamentally rebalance the world economic system. He's moved America into a whole new foreign policy doctrine. He's done what we were told repeatedly was impossible, which is closing the southern border, purging the bureaucracy, ripping up international agreements, and so on. And whether Trump's been successful in doing all these things, whether they've been well thought out or not, the fact remains that Trump has fundamentally changed the table stakes, as it were. He's changed what is required in order to call yourself... 5? Yeah. He's changed what it takes to call yourself a serious populist party. So evaluating these kind of movements and populist movements going forward, I'd like to just pose a couple of tests and things that I'd like to hold to account various different populist movements by, and maybe none of them meet these tests, or maybe none of them pass them with flying colours. But the first is what I call the institutional test. Can any of these populist or counter-systemic forces actually reform the institutions, the fundamental institutions that make up the liberal order? And even in America, where they have a much more politically appointed system of the civil service, to take one institution, you already see the difficulty that Trump's encountered despite the mass firing of civil servants that was unleashed by Elon Musk. And things in the UK or in Europe are only going to be much, much more difficult, and populist forces need to be far more clear-eyed and far more radical about how to reform the institutions. We see in the case of the rape gangs example, we see just how difficult it is even to come to terms with that, which is something that a problem, a diagnosis that enjoys almost universal agreement among the population in the UK. And yet you see how difficult it is even to hold officials to account or truly reckon with what happens. So can populist forces actually reform the institutions? The second is what I'd call a kind of experimental test, which is that are they prepared to experiment and take risks and demonstrate some courage in adopting new policies or creating new forms? Now, I think this is really important because if the task we're faced with is in many ways revolutionary, then those of you who are familiar from your Roman history or reading Machiavelli will know that the survival of a political form, of a polity, depends on the degree to which people can breathe new life into it, create new institutional forms, create new forms of either political office and so on. And that involves taking a huge amount of risk. And the question then, the test is, do any of these counter-system populist forces possess the kind of the balls, really, to actually take big risks in experimenting? The third is a test of values, as it were, which is captured in J.D. Vance's question to European elites at Munich, which is, what do you guys all stand for? And actually, I think J.D. Vance's speech, which I loved, but he could have turned it back on himself quite easily. What does J.D. Vance stand for? Anti-interventionist, who was suddenly then very much behind the intervention in Iran. There are all these questions about what does even J.D. Vance, what does America stand for? Questions which are, of course, very pertinent here at home. What does Europe stand for? What does Britain stand for? What does Western civilization stand for? So it's not an easy question for our populist parties to answer, but I think they have to make a stab at answering some of these questions. The fourth test that I'd put is, can anybody hold together a workable coalition, like a movement? And we saw, again in America, we saw how quickly Trump's incredible coalition of various different forces, including tech oligarchs and dispossessed flyover state members and all the rest of it, we see very quickly how even that came undone. Within the space of a week, a couple of weeks, Trump lost Elon Musk because of the spending bill and lost Tucker Carlson because of the intervention in Iran. Can these populist forces hold together a wide enough movement? And there are bigger fish to fry on that test. That the difficulties that Trump faced kind of seem almost small in comparison to some of the other antinomies that have already been mentioned in populist parties. There's huge splits between, say, libertarian and socially conservative wings of the populist parties. There's increasingly, although this is often overplayed, but there are increasingly generational splits in the populist parties with lots of younger people, especially in Europe, are much more radical, much more anti-immigration than the kind of people who currently head these parties. So there are huge splits. Can any of these forces hold together a movement? But then the final and most important of all the tests is a test about freedom. And this is fundamental because if the key determining feature of the system that I tried to outline, what I called the liberal order, if the key determining feature of it was the desperate desire to control, render predictable and stable political life, then the only successful counterposition to that is a movement that is prepared to put human freedom front and center, is prepared to fundamentally assert the importance of being, as I said, experimental, trying new things, trusting ordinary people to govern their lives. There are lots of populist parties, by the way, that really fail this test. There's an attitude and a mood among lots of populists, at least I speak to in Europe, who are very, very suspicious of individual people. They want to bring back the monarchy, or they preferred the authoritarian times, say, of Franco in Spain, right? There's a lot of populist parties that really fail this test, and we shouldn't kid ourselves into thinking that all of the populists are on the same side as us when it comes to human freedom. So I think that's why I'd insist on the freedoms. That's a Freudian slip if ever there was one. That's why I'd really insist on the freedom test as the most fundamental one, because that's the key element of the system that I think I've diagnosed. And so the greatest, riskiest thing that populist forces could do is take a real institutional leap, place their faith in ordinary people, and put the extension of freedom at the center of their governments. And that would be a revolutionary act, a truly revolutionary act that would be the only thing of bringing an end properly to that order which has failed us and putting something new in its place. Thank you.